everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever struggled with anxiety or depression, then do we have the Lost Connection show for you. Today I'll be talking with Johann Hari, award-winning journalist, the best-selling author of at least 7 books, including Chasing the Scream, TED Talker Extraordinaire, his talk on connection has been viewed over 25 million times, and the author of a brilliant new book on depression, The Lost Connections. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about uncovering the real causes of depression and the unexpected solutions. That plus we'll talk about Snow White and apples, Christmas cards and KFC, baby spiders and Charlotte's Web, Solomon the baboon, the silence of Edgware, cows in Cambodia, chipmunks and salmon jerky, gotcha, and why in the world you might not want to take your child to see the bonobos. God. So welcome to the show, Johann. Are you ready to shine?
I am too British to answer questions like that with a great deal of enthusiasm, but I will do my best. I'm ready to talk.
Woohoo! I think you're doing great. So I don't know.
I spoke at a conference where there was this woman who spoke before me. It was about addiction, and it was in Britain, and there was this American woman who was a wonderful person, and she had as part of her kind of stump speech, she said to the audience, I want you to reach out and touch the person next to you. And I'm sure this would go down really well in the US. In Britain, there was just this horrific, awkward, slight shuffling of people's bodies. And I remember I spoke immediately after her and I just said to the audience, I'm British, so I will never ask you to touch another human being as long as you live. And there was an air of relief. So there's a slight, although I spend most of my time in the US, we've got a bit of I'm still a bit too British to be enthusiastic about things like that.
That may be why you don't have a chapter as one of the solutions on hugging.
That's true. I'm a rare British hugger. I believe in hugging.
Very good.
I'm something of an outcast in my own nation as a result.
I like it when we look at working with somebody, working with anybody. We always ask, what's the huggability factor? And I hope you take this in quite the right way. You have a high huggability factor, I can tell.
Thank you. I had a brief period of my life where I had to dress as Sir Hug-a-Lot, the Care Bear, in McDonald's Christmas parties. And although I never realized until that moment how aggressive many children are when they see Sir Hug-a-Lot. But anyway, so yeah, I'd like to think I was, yeah.
That's very cool because all of the Care Bears, they specialized in being open-hearted.
Exactly.
So let's go from there. And this is a perfect segue from Care Bears to, please forgive me, your earliest days. What were they like? Were you happy?
Yeah, some of the time. I mean, so the reason I wrote my book Lost Connections is because when I was in my teenage years, I developed quite bad depression. And I remember going to my doctor and saying that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me. And I couldn't control it or regulate it. I didn't really understand it. I felt quite ashamed of it. And I was really looking for an answer and a solution, explanation and a solution. And my doctor told me a story that a lot of people, this was the late 90s, story lots of people all over the world were being told at that time, that I now realize was really oversimplified. So my doctor said, we know why people feel this way. There's a chemical called serotonin in people's brains. It makes them feel good. Some people are naturally lacking it. They've got a chemical imbalance in their brains. All we need to do is give you these drugs and you're going to feel better. So I started taking an antidepressant called Paxil.
Yeah.
I felt a lot better, really significantly better. And then a few months later, this feeling of pain started to come back. So I went back to my doctor. He said, clearly I didn't give you a high enough dose. He gave me a higher dose. Again, I felt better. Again, this feeling of pain came back. And I was really in this cycle of taking higher and higher doses of the drug until for 13 years, I was taking the maximum dose you're allowed to take, at the end of which I was still depressed. And really there were these 2 mysteries kind of haunting me, which led me to write the book. The first is I'm nearly 40 years old. In a couple of months, I'm 40 years old. And every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased in the United States and across the Western world. And and by the time towards the end of me using these drugs, I was kind of thinking, well, if my doctor was right, if it was just a problem in people's brains, why would it be rising so much, right? It wouldn't just be that all of our brains started to malfunction at the same time. And then there was a much more personal mystery, which is why was I still depressed, right? I was doing everything that I was being told to do, by the story our culture was telling, and yet I was still in really deep pain. So I ended up going, as you know, in this big journey all over the world, over 40,000 miles. I wanted to sit with people, the leading experts in the world, about what causes depression and anxiety, and people with very different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help them feel better. And I learned a huge amount.
Fantastic. And we're going to try to dive into as many of these pieces as we can. From a personal point of view, you were on antidepressants for at least 13 years. I imagine there was a personal element to it. And how are you now? And I imagine you would never go back.
I'm always very careful about how I answer this because, I was trained in the social sciences at Cambridge University, and then I was a journalist for many years. So my book, Lost Connections, isn't like a personal memoir where I say, well, I did this and you can too. It's about what actually causes depression and anxiety and the best scientific evidence about what solves them. And in a sense, my individual story isn't evidence in that, right? I mean, I think my individual story is important to me. I think it can help carry people through the scientific evidence, but I wouldn't base my my findings don't come from the kind of personal anecdote of my own life. But I think the heart of what I think would connect with a lot of people listening to this, and you mentioned this in relation to chemical antidepressants, which I'm sure we'll come to, which have a role to play. But I learned that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are there's 9 causes that we've discovered so far. There will probably be others that we don't know about yet. And 2 of them are indeed biological, right? Your genes can make you more vulnerable to anxiety and depression. And there are real changes that happen in your brain when you become depressed and anxious that make it harder to get out. But most of the causes of depression and anxiety are not in our biology, they're in the way we're living, right? They're in our psychology and they're in our environment. And that opens up a very different way of responding to depression and anxiety that we have to look at alongside trying to deal with the biological aspects of it. And I think one thing that connects a lot of the causes that I learned about, not all of them, is everyone listening to your show knows that they have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need clean air, you need shelter. If I took those things away from any of your listeners, they'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And our culture is good at lots of things. I'm really glad to be alive today. But we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs that all human beings have. And it's certainly not the only thing that's going on, but I think it's the main reason why we have this rising epidemic, not just of depression and anxiety, but of addiction, of all sorts of indicators of despair, political extremism, lots of other things that are going on.
Thank you. And I want to dive into each one of these 9 things as much as we can in an hour. Before we do that, I want to talk about something that I've seen people have success with. I've also seen people stuck on, and I've seen people do horrifically with. Maybe you can tell us about the crack in the old story and a little bit about the tractor or the wand.
So, yeah, chemical antidepressants. So I think we need to have a nuanced conversation about chemical antidepressants. Very often the debate boils down to, I think, a rather crude, are you in favor of them or are you against them? And to me, there are many important things to say about chemical antidepressants, but if I could only say 2 things, I would point to 2 pieces of scientific evidence. Yeah. The first is an amazing piece of research that was done by Professor Irving Kirsch, who's the leading expert at Harvard Medical School on this. So depression is generally measured by something called the Hamilton scale. I've always felt really sorry for whoever Hamilton was that really remember him by how miserable we all are. But to give you a sense of it, the Hamilton scale goes from 1, where you would be dancing around in ecstasy, maybe on ecstasy, to 51, where you would be acutely suicidal. And to give you a sense of movement on the Hamilton scale, if you improve your sleep patterns, you'll generally gain 6 points on the Hamilton scale. And if your sleep patterns deteriorate, like when you have a baby, you'll generally go 6 points the other way. On average, over time, chemical antidepressants move you 1.8 points on the Hamilton scale. Now, it's important to say a few things about that. Firstly, that's an average. So I initially got much more than that. Over time, I got less. And some people will get more, consistently get more, and some people will consistently get less. It's also important to say 1.8 points is not nothing, right? 1.8 points is something. You can see how that will take the edge off really acute pain. And taking the edge off really acute pain has obvious value. But you can also see it's not solving the problem for most people, right? It has value for some people, but it's not solving the problem. And one of the other piece of evidence I point to, which also helps us to know that, is something called the STAR-D trial. It's really the only good long-term research we've got into the effects of chemical antidepressants. And to cut a long story short, what it found is most people taking chemical antidepressants become depressed again. It doesn't mean they have no value. They do take the edge off for some people, but they're not solving the problem. And one of the reasons they're not solving the problem is because depression is not, and this is one of the things that really shocked me in the research I did, speaking to leading experts in the world, to learn that depression is not caused by low serotonin. In fact, one of the leading experts, Professor Andrew Scull at Yale, has put it that he says it's deeply misleading and unscientific to say depression is caused by low serotonin. One of the leading experts here in Britain, Dr. David Healy, told me, you can't even say the idea that depression is caused by low serotonin has been discredited, because it was never credited. There was never a time when half of the scientists in the field believed it was true. The reason we were sold that story is because it was the story the drug company PRs figured out was the best way to market their drugs. Now, again, that doesn't mean there's no value in the drugs, right? Headaches are not caused by an aspirin deficiency. Doesn't mean that aspirin doesn't have some effect and doesn't help people. But if we want to deal with this enormous and rising epidemic of depression and anxiety, we've got to admit there's something missing in what we've been doing. Because for more than 30 years now, we've been massively increasing chemical antidepressant prescriptions. And for more than 30 years now, depression has continued to rise every year. It's not risen because of the chemical antidepressants. As I say, they've taken the edge off. But there's something missing. And one of the things that really helped me to think about what is it that's missing? What are we getting wrong? Is when I went and interviewed a wonderful South African psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield. And Derek happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when chemical antidepressants were first introduced in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodian doctors, didn't know what these drugs were. So they were like, what are they? And Dr. Summerfield explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. Said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy, right? Like St. John's wort, ginkgo biloba, something like that. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the United States and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb and he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you got an artificial limb. I'm guessing it was pretty traumatic for obvious reasons. The guy started to cry all day, didn't want to get out of bed. He developed classic depression. They said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And he said, well, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. It had causes in his life. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds like a joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. He gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not crazy. You're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what we need to do is listen to your pain, honor your pain, and give you very practical help to deal with the things that are causing you such pain.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. On that note, can something really stressful cause or trigger us to go into a spiral of depression?
Yeah, one of the things that's incredible is that we've got to the point where questions like that have to be asked, right? Because actually, if you look at the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in Lost Connections, in some ways, there's lots of really important stories about them, lots of really important studies, lots of really important things, and particularly the last third of the book about solutions has a lot of things people won't know. But to be honest, a lot of it's really obvious, right? And what's kind of incredible is that we've been taught to not see the really obvious things in front of us. So if you had said to my grandmother or your grandmother, if you have a really stressful experience in your life and things go wrong, are you more likely to feel absolutely terrible and not want to get out of bed and feel... I mean, my grandmother would have said, well, no, Sherlock, right? Like that, I mean, she would have sworn a bit worse than that because she was from Glasgow. But I remember, so I was talking in an interview recently about loneliness and depression. And I can talk about that to you in a minute. And I was explaining this incredibly strong, well, we are the loneliest society there's ever been, right? There's an incredible study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this study years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none, right? What does it do to people if they're going through life alone, right? One of the leading experts in the world on loneliness, and a wonderful man called Professor John Cacioppo, who was at the University of Chicago, is someone I interviewed a lot. And, I remember him saying to me, why do we exist, right, you and I? Why do everyone you've ever met, why do they exist? One reason is because our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They were not faster than the animals they took down. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down, but they were a lot better at banding together into tribes and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And in the circumstances where we evolved, if you were separated from the tribe, if you had no one to look out for you, you were depressed and anxious for a really good reason. You were about to die. You were in terrible danger. These are the impulses we still have. So I was talking about this in this interview. And I was explaining there's overwhelming scientific evidence that loneliness has gone up and that loneliness causes depression and anxiety. And this interviewer said to me, well, this is a very controversial argument. And I thought, wow, did we get to the point where saying if you're lonely, you're more likely to be depressed and anxious is regarded as controversial? It's extraordinary that we've been told such a simplified story about depression that it's driven the most obvious insights out of our heads. So we end up asking ourselves, well, and which means that people are depressed and left in this mode of thinking, well, why do I feel like this? When actually, intuitively, we know not all the reasons, and there's lots of other things we'll talk about that are more complex, but many of the things that we talked about, if you've had a deeply traumatic childhood, of course, and you've never been able to deal with the shame of it, of course you're more likely to be depressed. And saying to someone who's had a deeply, let's take an extreme example, someone who's been raped as a child and never got a chance to deal with the shame and horror that causes, saying to them, oh, you've just got a chemical imbalance in your brain, is both absurd and, to be honest, grotesque.
So let's go. Thank you. Let's go from there and let's talk about as many of the 9 as we can, and then I want to dive into some solutions. With that said, for full disclosure, we moved out here to this beautiful place just by Aspen, Colorado, about 6 months ago. I'm considered kind of Mr. Positivity, although I give tips and tools. However, I got depressed, and the reason I got depressed was I had no connections out here. Once I started getting back to the gym, to any gym, so that I had regular contact with people, I started feeling better. It was like vitamin G for me. Get me some social interaction, because it turns out we think we have social interaction. I am interacting with you via Skype right now, but it's still not quite the same thing.
I think that's a really good point.
So let's hit the 9 here, and we're going to go into at least one of them where we're going to talk more about this. Connection 1, disconnection, or cause 1, disconnection from meaningful work, such as Joe Phillips and a paint department or paint store.
Yeah, so one of the things I noticed is that lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, their depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I started to look at the evidence. How do people feel about their work? Gallup did a really good study of this in the United States. And they discovered 13% of us, 13%, like our work most of the time. 63% of us are what they called sleepworking, don't like it, don't hate it, you just get through the day. And 24% of people hate and fear their jobs. I was quite struck by that. 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of their waking lives. And that thing is taking up more and more of our lives, per hours per day. I started to think, could that have some relationship with our mental health? So I started to look at the best science around this. I learned that an amazing man called Professor Michael Marmot had made breakthroughs about this in the 1970s. And he had discovered the key factor that causes depression at work is if you go to work tomorrow and you are controlled, so you have low or no choices over your work, you are way more likely to become depressed and anxious. And this comes back to what we were saying about needs. People need to feel their life is meaningful. And if you're controlled all the time, you can't construct meaning out of your life, or it's much harder to. And so at first when I learned this, I actually misunderstood what I was learning. I thought this was a really bleak message, right? I thought it was saying, okay, you've got this elite 13% at the top who get to have nice jobs, and they're going to be okay, but then, or most of them, but then you've got everyone else who's condemned to this kind of misery. And I thought about my dad, who was a bus driver, my grandmother, whose job was to clean toilets, my brother, who's an Uber driver. I was like, wow, no, well, what are we saying? And then I realized what Professor Marmot was telling me. It's not the work that makes you depressed. It's being controlled at work. And it turns out if we think about the cow, there's a kind of cow for that, right? So I went to Baltimore to meet this amazing woman called Meredith Keogh. Meredith used to go to bed every Sunday night, sick with anxiety, right? She had an office job. As she would tell you, it wasn't the worst office job in the world. She wasn't, being bullied or harassed or anything. But it was really monotonous. She had very little control. And she couldn't bear the thought this was going to be the next 40 years of her life. So one day with her husband, Josh, she did this quite bold thing. Josh had worked in bike stores since he was a kid in Baltimore, he was a teenager. And, that's pretty controlled work. It's insecure. You've got no rights at work. And one day, Josh and his colleagues were sitting in the bike store doing their work. And they just asked themselves, what does our boss actually do? They didn't hate their boss. He wasn't particularly, they quite liked him as a person. But they were like, we seem to fix all the bikes and he seems to make all the money. So they decided they were going to do something quite bold. They decided they were going to set up a bike store of their own that worked on a different principle. So where they'd worked before, most people listening to your show will work in a place like this, was a corporation. You've got a boss at the top who's like the dictator. Sometimes he's a nice dictator. Sometimes she's a nasty dictator. Either way, or the genders can be switched in that case. And you do what you're told, right? They decided they were going to set up a bike store based on an older American idea. The bike store they set up is a democratic cooperative. They don't have a boss. They share the profits. They take the decisions about the business together by voting once a fortnight. In practice, they agree most of the time, but sometimes they vote. They share out the good tasks and the crappy tasks, so no one gets stuck with the crappy tasks. And one of the things that was so striking to me spending time in their business, Baltimore Bicycle Works, was how many of them talked about how they used to be depressed and anxious in the previous way of working, but were not depressed and anxious now. And it's important to say, it's not like they gave up their jobs fixing bikes and went off to become like Beyonce's backing singers or something, right? They fixed bikes before, they fix bikes now. What was the difference? Now they've got control over their work. There is no reason why we should be structuring our society in a way that makes most of us feel terrible, right? Every business could be a democratic cooperative. They actually grow faster and are more efficient because people are more committed to them. That's a big structural shift, but we've all lived through big structural shifts, right? My grandmothers weren't allowed to have bank accounts when they got married. I'm gay. I didn't even hear the concept of gay marriage until I was 19 years old, and I thought, well, that'll never happen, right? So big changes can happen, and if something is making so many of us depressed, then we really need to change it as a society.
It makes me think of, in fact, I just watched a really terrible movie yesterday that was like a remake-ish of Ferris Bueller meets, what is it? Not the girl from 16 Candles, Molly Ringwald, Breakfast Club. It was a remake of this.
It's blasphemy to remake those two.
And it was a kid who got expelled from school and was exceptionally happy that he got expelled, except his mom was going to kill him, and his brother had already been sent off to a prison, in essence, by the parents for not doing well in school. Kids, if they're too controlled, they're going to get very depressed as well.
There's an incredible study in Britain. I suspect the figure would be worse for the United States, but no one's done it. The average British child now spends less time outdoors than the average maximum security prisoner.
Wow.
Because by law, a maximum security prisoner has to have 60 minutes a day. What we've done to childhood is so horrendous. And then, of course, we pathologize the children and say there's something wrong with their brains. So there's been Professor Johann Hari has done good work on this. He's a wonderful person, showing that I think the amount of unsupervised play that children has fallen by something like 40% in the last 30 years. I mean, it's devastating what we've done. Children have needs. They need to be able to run around. They need to be part of a community. The way we raise children is deeply weird, right? And it's not the fault of anyone doing it. They're under tremendous pressure themselves. But the idea that you would raise a child where there's just two or even one adults there to provide everything for them, no humans have ever raised children like that. The children have always been raised by communities, by villages, by groups of people. And we really turned our children, well, we treat them worse than our rapists and murderers when it comes to going outdoors, right? That tells you something about something that's gone catastrophically wrong. And it's one of the reasons why we're having such an epidemic. It's one of many reasons why we're having such an epidemic of childhood anxiety and other things that are described as pathologies. Professor Jill Twenge has shown the average teenage girl now has the same level of anxiety that the average mental patient had in the 1950s, someone who's admitted to a psychiatric hospital, because we're not meeting their needs, right, as a society, as a culture.
So we're going to double back around kids for sure. I'm going to go to cause number 2 now. Thank you for sharing on that. And this leads to kids tremendously because they're stuck in their phones, in their phone world now, disconnection from other people.
Yeah, so I think the internet, this is a complex one. And I wanted to think about it. So I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the world outside Spokane in Washington. It's called Restart Washington. They're great people. And it's really fascinating because the doctor, so the simplistic thing to say would be the internet hijacked our brains and made us all really lonely. And I think that is not right, actually. And it's something more complex and interesting going on. So as I spent time with the young people, so they get a whole range of people at Restart Washington, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with multiplayer role-play games like World of Warcraft or Fortnite. And I remember talking to Dr. Hilary Cash, who runs Restart Washington, and her saying to me something like, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games? Because they're getting something out of it. They're getting things that they used to get from the culture, but they no longer get. They're getting a sense of tribe. They're getting a sense of identity. They're getting a sense they can physically roam around because, as we say, they're like prisoners. They get a sense they're good at something, that people see them. But I actually think what they're getting is like a parody of those things, right? The relationship between social media and social life, I think, is a bit like the relationship between pornography and sex, right? I'm not anti-porn, but if your whole sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd be going around pissed off and irritated the whole time because that's not what you need, right? That's a kind of
two-dimensional.
A two-dimensional version of what you need. No one looks at porn for half an hour and then feels held and valued, right? The way you do after sex, at least if it goes well. And so I think what's happened is the internet comes along at this moment when a lot of the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in Lost Connections are already supercharged, right? You've already got, huge increase in loneliness, huge increase in people finding their work meaningless and controlled, and lots of the other things we're going to go on to talk about. And what happens is the internet arrives and it looks a lot like the things we've lost, right? You've lost friends, here's some Facebook friends. You've lost status, here's some status updates, but it's not the thing we've lost. And so, like all addictions, it's an attempt to fill a hole, but actually it deepens the hole. And so I think we need to understand the internet in that slightly more internet obsession in that slightly more complex context. It's not just that the internet did it to us. That's not true. The internet is an attempted solution to the problem that isn't actually getting us there. Not that there isn't some value in the internet, obviously.
Thank you. So let's go from there, and we're probably going to even double back on the internet a little bit. Disconnection from meaningful values.
Everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? And as you know, I had a KFC obsession for many years. But what's interesting is something similar has happened with our values. A kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. There's a brilliant man called Professor Tim Kasser, who you should have on your show. He's brilliant. He's just got a new book come out, who's done really fascinating work on this. So Professor Kasser has shown two really important things. Firstly, the more you think life is about money and status and how you look to other people in this kind of showing off way, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by quite a significant amount. He's also shown, as a society, we have become much more driven by these junk values. We've become much more motivated by money and status and, showing off. And it's a key factor in why we're having this depression and anxiety epidemic, because again, it doesn't meet our needs, right? Everyone listening to your show knows they are not going to lie on their deathbed and think about all the things they bought or all the retweets they got, right? They're going to think about moments of love and connection and meaning in their lives. And yet, as a society, the way Professor Kasser puts it, we live in a machine that's designed to get us to neglect what is most important in life, right? We live surrounded by advertising that tells us the solution to our distress is just to buy crap we don't need and show it off on social media to people who don't want to see it. And that requires a fundamental reorientation in our values. And Professor Kasser has shown really interesting ways that we can do that.
So, and in fact, there was a, not study, but it was fascinating law in, what was it, Palo Santo in Brazil, where they wiped out the advertising. And how did people feel afterwards?
Yeah, Sao Paulo banned all outdoor advertising. And there haven't been good studies of this, so this is anecdotal, but people there really, there is better evidence from Professor Kasser on other things. But they, people said it made them feel much better. If you're not, look, at the point of advertising, when advertising people talk among themselves, they admit this quite candidly, is to make you, in advertising, they have a phrase called invented wants, right? You don't sell the product, you sell the need for the product. So what would be, sometimes they do it so crudely that we notice. Like, for example, Dove led a campaign, 7-8 years ago now, where they said, it was marketed as like a self-help thing where they go, women, are you ashamed of how wrinkly and disgusting your armpits look after they've been shaved? Buy this new product. And of course, no one thought their armpits looked wrinkly and disgusting, right? No, that's what human armpits look like, right? And there was a bit of a backlash because they did that too crudely. Yeah. But the whole of advertising works that way. Of course, it's got to make you feel bad if you don't have their product. And it's, by the way, the relief you get from having the product can only be quite temporary. Otherwise you're not going to carry on buying more stuff. Advertising is like the ultimate frenemy, right? It's saying, oh, babe, I love you. I think you're great. If only you didn't stink so much. I'm only telling you because you're my friend, right? That's the logic of it.
Yeah. So let's go from there and let's talk about number 4, disconnection from childhood trauma. And since it's taking time to go through here, if you want to give a solution with each one, we can do that. So we make sure we get all of this and get people some good ideas how to start rebuilding things in their lives.
This was the hardest cause of depression and anxiety for me to learn about, for various reasons. I'll tell you how I learned how something really important was discovered about this. And for a minute, your listeners are going to think, why is he talking about this? It's got nothing to do with depression, but it led to a breakthrough in depression. I don't think you can really understand it if you don't understand how it was discovered. So in the mid-1980s, in San Diego, in California, a doctor called Vincent Felitti was given a difficult job. He was approached by the big not-for-profit medical provider in California, Kaiser Permanente, and they said, look, we've got this problem. We don't know what to do. Every year, obesity is rising, and every year we're trying things like diet plan, giving people diet plans, even giving them like personal trainers, and it wasn't making very much difference. Obesity was continuing to rise. So they gave Dr. Felitti quite a big budget, and they said, just do blue skies research, figure out what the hell we can do here.
Yeah.
So he started to work with 250 severely obese people who weighed more than 400 pounds. And one day he has an idea talking to one of them that seems like, and in many ways is quite a dumb idea. He asked himself, what would happen if really severely obese people literally just stopped eating? And we gave them vitamin shots so they didn't get like scurvy or whatever. Would they just burn through the fat stores in their bodies and lose weight? And in one sense, crazily, it worked, right? So there's a woman who I'm going to call Susan to protect her medical confidentiality, who went down from more than 400 pounds to 138 pounds. Incredible, right? Everyone's celebrating. They're telling Dr. Felitti he saved her life. And then one day, Susan just cracked. She went to KFC or somewhere like that, starts obsessively eating, and quite quickly is back to a dangerous weight. And Dr. Felitti called Susan in and he said, Susan, what happened? And she looked down. She said, I don't know. And he said, well, tell me about the day that you cracked. Did anything happen that day? Turns out something had happened that day that had never happened to Susan. She'd been in a bar and a man had hit on her. Not in an awful predatory way or anything, but he'd expressed sexual interest in her. She'd felt really freaked out. She'd run away. Dr. Felitti asked her then, when did you start to put on weight? In her case, it was when she was 11. He said, did anything happen when you were 11 that didn't happen when you were 9, didn't happen when you were 14, anything? And she looked down and she said, that's when my grandfather started to rape me. Dr. Felitti interviewed everyone in the program, and he found out that 55% of them had put on their extreme weight in the aftermath of being sexually abused, which is obviously so much higher than the general population, 55%. It's like, what's going on here? Susan explained it to him. She said, overweight is overlooked, and that's what I need to be. Dr. Felitti realized this thing that appears to be a pathology, and of course is very bad for you, obesity, was performing a function.
Protection.
Exactly. Protection from sexual attention. Not that you get no sexual attention if you're obese, but you obviously get less. And I remember, so Dr. Felitti, this is a small study. So Dr. Felitti went to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and he got a load of funding to do a much bigger, more detailed study. So everyone who came for healthcare in San Diego in a whole year to Kaiser Permanente was given a questionnaire that had 2 parts. First part said, did any of these bad things happen to you when you were a kid? Things like sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. And the second part said, have you had any of these problems as an adult? Things like obesity. And then they added depression, suicide attempts, addiction. And when the CDC added the figures up, at first people thought there'd just been a mistake with the numbers because they were so weird. For every category of childhood trauma you experienced, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to become depressed. But when you went into the multiple categories, things just exploded. If you'd had 6 of these categories of childhood trauma, you were 3,100% more likely to have attempted suicide and 4,600% more likely to have an addiction problem. I mean, these are remarkable. You just don't get figures like this very often. And the reason I say this was very difficult for me to learn about is I remember the first time I went to see Dr. Felitti in San Diego. He's a wonderful, good, kind man. And I remember shaking with anger when I left.
Why?
And so when I was a child, I'd experienced some very extreme acts from an adult in my life. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to integrate that into how I thought about myself. I didn't want to give this individual power over me now. It sounds absurd to say I'd never thought about it in relation to my own depression, but I hadn't. But one of the reasons I'm glad I did stay with this cause is because of what Dr. Felitti discovered next, which I think is incredibly important for everyone listening to know. So if someone had indicated on their form that they'd experienced one or more of these forms of childhood trauma, their doctor was told, don't call them back in, but next time they come in with some other problem, say to them something like this: I see that when you were a child, you were sexually abused or whatever the abuse was. I'm really, really sorry that happened to you. That should never have happened. Would you like to talk about it? And about 40%, I think it was 40% of people said, I don't want to talk about it, but 60% of people did want to talk about it. And they wanted to talk about it on average for 5 minutes. What's fascinating is just those 5 minutes of an authority figure saying, I'm so sorry, this should never have happened. That alone led to a really significant fall in depression and anxiety. And then it was randomized. Some of them were referred to a therapist so they could talk about it more, and they had an even bigger fall. And this fits with a wider body of evidence from people like Professor James Pennebaker at Florida State University, who have shown it's not trauma that destroys you, it's shame about the trauma. Mm-hmm. And if you can get safe places to release your trauma, that actually leads to a really positive improvement in both physical and mental health. For example, during the AIDS crisis, openly gay men died on average 2 years later than closeted gay men, even when they got healthcare at the same time. Shame destroys you. Releasing that shame is a profound antidepressant.
Thank you. Let's go from there to disconnection from status and respect.
Yeah, so if you feel humiliated, you're much more likely to become depressed and anxious. When our cousins, baboons. So they live in the men, not the women, interestingly, but the men live in a hierarchy. So say there's 20 baboons in the troop, they go from 1 at the top to 20 at the bottom, and every baboon knows where they are in the hierarchy. So number 9 knows he's above number 10. He can walk up to number 10 and just take his banana or push him out of the shade, and number 11 can do that to number 12, and so on. When you get to the bottom of the baboon rankings, what do? They put their heads down. They cover their heads. They don't want to get up. They show what's called a submission gesture. So they raise their butts and they put their bodies down, and it's basically, and they don't move. And it's basically them saying, "You beat me. Leave me alone. You got me. I can't take it anymore." Right? And a man called Professor Paul Gilbert, who's a British guy, argues that one of the things depression is the submission response. Right? If you're humiliated and beaten down day after day, week after week, whether it's at work or in where you live, a lot of people just have this submission response, right? Not consciously, just, okay, you beat me, just leave me alone, right?
Yeah.
And as a society and as a culture, again, there's been a move as we become much more unequal of more people feeling beaten down and humiliated, right? So in the 1950s, on average, a CEO earned 13 times more than the person at the bottom of the company. It's now 450 times, right? The 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, who've done nothing to earn their money, they're literally just heirs, they inherited it, own more than the bottom 100 million Americans, right? So you've had this big increase in humiliation. We see all these rich people on television, but most of us, it's forever out of grasp. We're actually going backwards. More than half of Americans are so financially stressed they've not been able to set aside $500 for if a crisis comes along. These things create a sense of humiliation, right? And one of the ways that manifests is a submission gesture and depression.
Thank you. So let's go from baboons and depression, and let's talk about a personal favorite in reverse of mine, which is disconnection from the natural world.
Yeah, one of the people who taught me a lot about this is a wonderful Chilean primatologist called Isabel Benque. She's a friend of mine and is a really remarkable human being, but who I write about in the book. But look, animals in zoos deprived of their natural habitats go crazy. It's called zoochosis, right? Take a polar bear out of its habitat, it'll lose its mind. Horses will start obsessively swaying. Parrots will rip out their feathers. As human beings, we have been taken out of our natural habitat to a large degree, right? And there's all sorts of interesting studies about this that show exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. And being deprived of the natural world is terrible for human beings. There's a really interesting little study that looked at Michigan State Prison, not by design, just by coincidence, has one part of the prison that looks out over beautiful, lush green fields, and another part of the prison that looks out over concrete. And it's totally random where you end up. And the people who looked out over the concrete were 40% more likely to develop mental health problems than the people who looked out over lush green fields, right? Because the lush green fields are the equivalent of the polar bear looking out over the ice, and the concrete is the equivalent of the polar bear looking out over concrete, right?
I was walking through New York City a few years ago, and some unusual bird for New York City landed on a tree in front of me. And I looked up at it, and a gentleman wondered what I was looking at. And I go, look at that bird. And he said something that I saw that you wrote in this book as well. I don't do nature.
Yeah, I think if you so I used to feel, and if you grow up in, I grew up in a very urban environment. I grew up in London, and I think we can become very disconnected from the things we need. That's true across the board, right? You'll meet people who say, well, I prefer being alone, right? I mean, of course, we all need to be alone sometimes, or you'll get people who say, well, I just like, thinking about money. That's what I get off on. We can become profound. We can be taught to think we want things that actually don't meet our needs. That's very easy. In fact, in this culture, it's the norm.
So, and that actually leads back to the one before, I think it was, which is actually, it was several before, but the concept that if we can buy our way to happiness rather than getting out into the natural world and plugging back in naturally, maybe, to happiness.
Yeah. One of the most moving, one of the great heroes in my book is a man called Dr. Sam Everington, who was is a doctor in East London, a poor part of East London where I lived for a long time, although sadly he was never my doctor. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with really bad depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants. He thinks they have some role to play. But he could also see most of the people he was giving them to were still depressed after a little while. And he could also see that they were depressed for perfectly good reasons. So one of them is they were really lonely. So one day he decided to pioneer a different approach. A woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know pretty well. Lisa had been shut away in her home with terrible depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, "Don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to prescribe something else." There was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was known as Dog Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like. It was just kind of had scrubland. And Sam said to Lisa, "What I'd like to do is come and turn up a couple of times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been quite anxious. And with a group of other depressed and anxious people, let's make something nice, right?" The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But as the group met, they decided what they were going to do is turn this scrubland into a garden, beautiful garden. They knew nothing about gardening. They were inner city people like me. So they started learning gardening. They started reading about it. They started looking about it online. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. And it fits with the evidence. Exposure to the natural world is a very powerful antidepressant. Also, they began to form a tribe. They started to look after each other. They started to care about each other. They started to notice if one of them didn't turn up and go looking for them, right? And the way Lisa put it to me is the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason, right? And this is something I saw all over the world. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we're so depressed and anxious in the first place.
Thank you. So let's go from there, and then we're going to dive into solutions. Cause 7, disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. And in this case, they're hopeful for their gardens.
Yeah, I mean, there's a deeper thing going on, isn't there? That everyone needs to feel they have a future that makes sense. And one of the things that's been happening is a fragmentation of our sense of the future, right? So think about my brother's an Uber driver, right? We all know there's been this move towards what's called the gig economy, which is ridiculous. It makes it sound like we're all Kanye West performing at Madison Square Gardens rather than having 3 jobs just trying to pay the rent. But, there's no sharing of risk in the gig economy, right? You have a very fractured sense of the future. You don't have a contract. You don't have anything, right? You've just got tomorrow. And there's this really interesting research by Professor Michael Chandler, who it's really interesting. So as you know, in Canada, First Nations people, what we would call Native Americans in the US, have very high suicide rates, like horrifying, radically higher than white Canadians. And Professor Chandler did some really interesting research. So there's 451 tribal groups, First Nations in Canada. And he did this big analysis of this. And he discovered some of them have super high suicide rates and some have no suicide at all. And he was trying to figure out, well, what's going on, right? What's the difference? And what he found is some of these First Nations groups have fought to regain control of their community. They control their schools, their police service, their fire service. They've rebuilt their language. And other ones have been kept so beaten down and broken down, they haven't been able to do any of that. And what he found is when you track it on a graph, the suicide rate correlates very closely with the amount of control your community has. Because when your community controls your area, you feel like you understand what's going to happen in the future, right? You've got some control over it. And if you've got no control, it's just terrifying. And as a culture, we've become much more like those low control groups, right? You think about just how people work, how they live, fear of things like global warming, quite rightly, we should be afraid of it and we should be acting urgently. Our sense of the future has fragmented. So we have to think about how we restore a sense of the future. And obviously I talk about some experiments that have been done with that, very practical things that have led to a really significant reduction in depression.
Thank you. I'm going to jump past genetics here for a minute. I'm going to jump into the 6 strategies for reconnection. Reconnection 1, connecting to other people.
Yeah, so that's social prescribing. What I was talking about, the gardening program is a good example. But essentially anything that can get people to socially reconnect has a very powerful antidepressant effect. So doctors prescribing it is, as I say, study in Norway found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. Now, why is that not happening? Because it costs nothing and nobody profits to get Lisa to go gardening, whereas there's a $10 billion industry in drugging Lisa, right? But we don't have to be determined by that, right? Slavery was a huge industry. I'm not comparing psychiatric drugs to slavery. Psychiatric drugs do a lot of good for a lot of people, but as well as some harm for some people. But I'm pointing out that you can overthrow profit motives. Do not have to determine everything in a society. In fact, the best things in life are not determined by that.
Thank you. And would you say that those two are the same? Reconnection 1 to other people, reconnection 2, social prescribing.
Well, so reconnecting to other people is also, there's really interesting research about this. I interviewed a really interesting social scientist called Dr. Brett Ford, who did this fascinating research with her colleagues at Berkeley, where I saw her.
Happiness.
Yeah, so they wanted to study this quite simple thing. If you tried consciously to make yourself happier, let's say you decided I'm going to spend 2 hours a day trying to be happier, would you actually become happier? They did this research in 4 countries: the United States, Taiwan, Russia, and Japan. And what they found is, in the United States, if we try to make ourselves happier, we do not become happier. But in the other countries, if you try to make yourself happier, you do. And they were like, how can that be? What's going on? And they studied it more. What they discovered was, in the United States, in general, if we try to make ourselves happier, what we do is do something for ourselves. Mm-hmm. I buy myself something. I do retail therapy. We even have a phrase for it. I show off on Instagram, whatever the hell it is. In the other countries, generally, on average, you try to make other people happier. If you want to be happier, you try to do something for your friends, your family, your community. So we have an instinctively individualistic idea of happiness. They have an instinctively collective idea of happiness. Beautiful. And our individualistic idea of happiness doesn't work. A species of individualists would have died out on the savannas of Africa. We wouldn't be here, right? That's not who we are.
And what I love, there was a study years ago where I think they gave somebody money. They found money on the street, said, "Oh, is this yours?" or something to this effect. And if the person took it and used that money, or however it worked, if the person took that $10 and used that money on themselves, they got a certain level of satisfaction. If they used that $10 to buy somebody else a gift, tremendously more happiness and satisfaction.
Yeah, we're a social species. Indulging yourself won't make you happy, right? Being part of a network of love and connection makes you happy.
Reconnection 3, to meaningful work. And how do we even do that today?
Yeah, so we talked about that in relation to Baltimore bikes and, giving people back control over their work. We need to move from working in corporations to working in cooperatives, and we need to change how that structure works as a society.
And then number 4, to meaningful values.
Yeah, so I talked before about how junk values make people depressed. And there's lots of things we can do. Partly it's about getting the contaminants out of the atmosphere. So we should just I think we should just ban most advertising, and we should very strictly regulate what remains. So a good example is in Britain, there was a campaign about 5 years ago on the London subway system, the Underground, of it was an image of an incredibly, either a super buff man mm-hmm. or an incredibly mm-hmm. lean woman. And it said, are you beach body ready? And it was selling some like protein shake or something. The clear implication being, if you don't look like this dude or this woman, you're not ready to go onto the beach, right? And again, that was one of the moments when the advertising industry was so crude that it triggered a backlash. and people vandalized it all over London. And in the end, the mayor of London ordered that all these adverts get taken down because they were just making people feel terrible about their bodies. Partly it's about getting the contaminants out of the atmosphere, and partly, so this is a really interesting experiment that was done with Professor Kasser, who made these breakthroughs, and this guy called Nathan Dungan, who's a very interesting guy. So Nathan Dungan was a financial advisor in Minneapolis, and he was asked by a school, a middle-class school, to come in and give some advice because the kids in this school were absolutely raging if their parents couldn't afford to buy them the latest Nike sneakers or whatever, or designer, whatever crap it is. And so Nathan's job was to advise people on like financial budgeting. So they were like, "Will you come in and explain budgeting to these kids?" So he comes in and explains budgeting, and they don't give a shit. Very quickly, he realizes this is not a budgeting issue, right? So he starts to learn about Professor Kasser's work, and he decided that together they decided to do this interesting program where what they would do is they would get kids and parents to come in once every 2 weeks, and they initially, so they talked about what they felt they had to have. They said, write down what you need to have. And very often the kids would write Nike sneakers. Sometimes the parents would write designer clothes or whatever. And then they would say, how will you feel if you get those things? What will be different in your life? And the kids would quite quickly say things like, I would feel accepted by the group. I would feel I had status. It wasn't something inherent to the sneakers, right? It wasn't like they wanted to be Michael Jordan and they wanted to bounce a bit higher. And of course, it doesn't take long once you get people to articulate that for them to go, well, why do I feel I need a sneakers to be accepted by a group, right? And then initially it was about deconstructing the junk values. And then it was about building up their sense of positive values. So they would say to them, well, what do you think is actually important in life? And the group would meet and discuss this once every few weeks. And what's fascinating is it led to a really significant shift in people's values over time, which we know relates to lower depression and anxiety. So, again, these things are just beneath the surface, right? They're not. It's not like explaining quantum physics to someone, right? Yeah. These are things we know in our hearts. It's just about helping to free people up in very practical ways to pursue what they know they need. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to go in a minute, but this is to me the most important. So we'll leave some of the others for other readers of the book to find. But to me, this is the most important insight, right? All this depression and anxiety and all this despair that's manifesting in things like addiction and political extremism, they are not meaningless pathologies. They are signals. They're telling us something really important. They're telling us we've built a culture that is not meeting our needs as human beings, but we don't have to live like this, right? There have been societies that meet people's human needs. It's not a golden past that we can go back to. There's lots of things that are better now, but we can meet people's needs. One of the things I learned for Lost Connections, is I went to places that had really significantly reduced depression and anxiety through very practical innovations that are entirely achievable. And so what we need to stop doing is insulting depression and anxiety, either by saying they're signs of craziness or personal weakness, or that they're just a biological problem. Of course, there's a biological component, very real biological component, but they're not just biological problems. And we need to hear what it's telling us, right? Because it's telling us something we really need to hear.
Thank you. 3 real quick questions. First off, most importantly, where can people go to find your book and to find out more?
So it'll be in any good bookstore, or even some bad bookstores. But if you go to www.thelostconnections.com, you can see where to buy the audiobook, which has been very popular, or the physical book. You can take a quiz to see how much you know about the causes of depression and anxiety. You can see what a whole range of people have said about the book, from Oprah to Hillary Clinton to Elton John to Russell Brand and to Ariana Huffington, lots of people. You can also listen to audio of lots of the amazing people we've been talking about, lots of the experts and other people who've been through depression and anxiety. And you can also see where to follow me on social media and all of that.
Fantastic. If you didn't catch thelostconnections.com, come on over to inspirenationshow.com. We'll get you over to thelostconnections.com. Always want to ask a question for parents and their kids. What do you want to tell parents for their kids with depression today?
I think part of the problem is that we've put the job of solving depression and anxiety just onto depressed people and their families, right? We don't do that with other problems, right? We don't say the job of solving car accidents goes on people who've already been mangled on the I-95 and their families, right? We have driving tests and seatbelts and airbags. We arrest DUIs. We have speed limits. Precisely because driving problems, traffic accidents have big social causes, we have big social solutions. And I think one of the very unfair things we do is we say to parents with depressed kids, well, it's your job to solve this, right? And they're stressed out and anxious and wrung out, and they've got to work 50 hours just to pay for the mortgage. And, they're in a nightmare situation themselves a lot of the time. In a sense, if we think about this problem in terms of being isolated individuals in our families, we're not going to solve it. For some individuals, we will. Some people are lucky enough that they can change their environment significantly. But for most people, it requires us to come together as citizens and deal with these things in a deeper way. This has deep causes. It's been rising, not just in your family, my family. It's been rising in families across the Western world. That's not a coincidence, right? There's something deep going on here. And we need solutions as deep as the problem.
Thank you. I think that answered my last question, which was any last words of wisdom.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go. I don't know if it's wisdom, but it's last words.
Johann, I can't thank you enough. This is beautiful. I'm going to recommend everybody to go out and get the Lost Connections. It's endemic, and it's something that will affect you at some point on some level. And if not, look right, look left. It's affecting one of those two people. I think it's affecting all of us on some level, whether we give it a label or not. So I can't thank you enough for bringing this out.
Oh, thanks. But thank you for engaging so deeply with the book, Michael. I really appreciate it. And stay in touch.
Will do. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the Lost Connections, and begin plugging back in today and shine bright. Woohoo!
Cheers, Michael. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!